November 2025 turned out to be one of the busiest months for executions in recent American history.
Breaking news from the Department of Corrections tonight as the state of South Carolina has carried out another execution. 44-year-old Stephen Bryant died by firing squad less than an hour ago. Bryant was put to death for the murders of 3 people in Sumter County back in 2004. The triple murderer made no final statement and briefly glanced at the 10 witnesses before a hood was placed over his head, and then the shots rang out. Bryant is now the 3rd South Carolina inmate to die by firing squad.
In just 8 days, 4 executions were scheduled across 3 different states. 3 of them were carried out. One was stopped at the last minute when a governor decided to show mercy. The crimes behind these executions stretched back decades, from a 1979 child murder to a 2004 killing spree. The methods used to carry out the sentences ranged from lethal injection to the rarely used firing squad. The month began on November 13, 2025, with 2 executions scheduled on the same day in 2 different states. In Florida, Brian Frederick Jennings was led into the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 66 years old, a former Marine who had spent more than 40 years on death row. His crime dated back to 1979, when he raped and murdered 8-year-old Rebecca Kunash. The little girl had been taken from her bedroom window while her parents were in another room of their home. Jennings took her to a canal where he sexually assaulted her. He then swung her by her legs against the ground so hard that he cracked her skull. After that, he drowned her in the canal. Jennings had been tried and sentenced to death 3 separate times for this crime. The first 2 death sentences were thrown out on appeal because of legal errors. The 3rd trial in 1986 finally produced a sentence that held up through decades of appeals. When prison officials asked Jennings if he had any final words before his execution, he said no in a loud voice. The drugs were given through an IV line, and he was pronounced dead at 6:20 in the evening. His execution was the 16th in Florida that year, setting a new record for the state. That same evening in Oklahoma, another man was supposed to die. Tremaine Wood was scheduled to receive a lethal injection for his part in the 2002 killing of a farm worker named Ronnie Wipf. Wood and his brother Zayton had tried to rob Wipf, and during the robbery, Wipf was stabbed to death. Wood had always said that while he was there during the robbery, it was his brother who actually did the stabbing. His brother Zayton had died in prison in 2019 while serving a life sentence. Wood had been waiting on death row for over 20 years. His execution was scheduled for the same evening as Jennings' execution in Florida. But just moments before the drugs were to be given, Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt made a very surprising decision.
Oklahoma death row inmate Tremaine Wood was just saved from execution at the last minute. A dramatic move from Governor Kevin Stitt, granting him clemency. KOCO's Elise Jones is at the state penitentiary there in McAlester, where this news was just breaking. Elise, you were there. You saw the reaction from the family. What's the latest there from the state penitentiary?
He granted clemency to Wood, changing his death sentence to life in prison. Wood's life was spared at the very last minute. The next day, November 14, 2025, South Carolina carried out one of the most unusual executions in modern American history. Stephen Christopher Bryant was put to death by firing squad at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. He was 46 years old. Bryant had been sentenced to death for a terrifying 5-day crime spree in October 2004 that left 3 people dead and 1 person badly wounded. It started when Bryant shot a fisherman named Clinton Brown at the Wateree River. Brown survived, but the violence was just beginning. The next day, Bryant murdered his own friend, a man named Clifton Gainey. After killing Gainey, Bryant robbed his trailer and then burned it to the ground. 2 days later, Bryant broke into the home of Willard Teachin, a retired Air Force sergeant. He spent hours in the house with Teachin before shooting him 9 times. After the murder, Bryant did something cruel and strange. He answered the dead man's phone when the victim's wife and daughter called. He told them their loved one was dead and identified himself as the Prowler. He also wrote messages in the victim's blood on the walls, taunting police to catch him. Bryant's final victim was Christopher Burgess, a man he met at a convenience store. Bryant loaded Burgess's motorcycle into his truck, drove him to an isolated road, and shot him to death. The firing squad execution was only the sixth of its kind in the United States since 1976, when the Supreme Court allowed states to start using the death penalty again. South Carolina had brought back the firing squad as an option because it was having trouble getting the drugs needed for lethal injection. Bryant's execution was the third firing squad execution in South Carolina that year. 6 days later, on November 20, 2025, Florida carried out its 17th execution of the year. Richard Barry Randolph was 62 years old when he was put to death for a crime he committed in 1988. Randolph had robbed, sexually assaulted, and murdered Minnie Ruth McCollum at the Handyway convenience store in East Palatka, Florida. Minnie was 62 years old, a widow who was well known and loved in her community. She managed the store and arrived every morning at 5:30 to get ready for the day. Randolph had once worked at the Handyway, and Minnie had been his manager. He came back to rob the store's safe, hoping to get about $1,000 to feed his crack cocaine addiction. But he could not get the safe open. When Minnie came back inside and found him trying to break into the safe, Randolph attacked her. The attack was savage and went on for a long time. Randolph beat Minnie with his fists. He kicked her over and over. He strangled her twice with the drawstring from his sweatshirt. He stabbed her multiple times with a knife. He sexually assaulted her. When the medical examiner looked at her body, he counted 334 bruises. Randolph left Minnie dying on the floor of the back room while he drove away in her car, taking only some lottery tickets because he never managed to open the safe. Randolph's case had gone through the courts for 37 years. His appeals focused on the fact that his trial lawyer had not properly investigated his terrible childhood. Randolph had been adopted as a baby and raised in a home filled with violence. His adoptive father beat him with belts and broomsticks and locked him in dark closets for days at a time. His adoptive mother was an alcoholic with mental illness who told him over and over that he was worthless. Nobody celebrated his birthdays. Nobody told him he was loved. By the end of November 2025, 44 people had been executed in the United States that year. This made 2025 the busiest year for executions since 2012. Florida alone had put 17 people to death, more than double the previous state record of 8 executions in a single year. Governor Ron DeSantis had signed more death warrants than any Florida governor since the death penalty came back in 1976. He said his goal was to bring justice to the families of victims who had waited decades to see the sentences carried out. But behind each execution was a story that could not be summed up in simple terms. Stories of victims whose lives were stolen by terrible violence. Stories of killers shaped by trauma, addiction, and choices that could never be taken back. Stories of families on both sides who waited years, sometimes decades, for an ending that could never truly heal their wounds. These are those stories. We begin with Brian Frederick Jennings. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. Brian Frederick Jennings was born on December 9, 1958. Little is publicly documented about his early childhood or family background. By age 20, Jennings had enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. Military service represented a path taken by thousands of young Americans during that era. The Marines instilled discipline, structure, and a code of conduct that emphasized honor and duty. In May 1979, Jennings was stationed as an active duty Marine. He had earned leave time and traveled to Merritt Island, Florida, to visit family. His aunt lived in the area, providing him a place to stay during his break from military duties. Merritt Island sits along Florida's Space Coast in Brevard County, a community known for its proximity to Kennedy Space Center and quiet residential neighborhoods. Jennings was 20 years old during this visit. He had completed his basic training and was serving his country in a branch of service known for producing disciplined soldiers. Nothing in the public record suggests any prior criminal history or behavioral issues that would have raised red flags. To those who knew him casually, he appeared to be a young serviceman enjoying time away from his military obligations. The early days of May 1979 in Brevard County were typical for the area. Families went about their daily routines. Children played in yards and rode bicycles through neighborhoods. Parents worked regular jobs and returned home to quiet evenings. The community felt safe, the kind of place where people left doors unlocked and children played outside until dark. Jennings spent his days during this leave period in ways that remain largely undocumented. He stayed with his aunt, presumably helping around the house or spending time with relatives. There were no reports of unusual behavior, no complaints from neighbors, no incidents that would later stand out as warning signs. He was simply one of thousands of young military personnel on leave across the country. The Marine Corps had accepted Jennings into its ranks. He had passed background checks, completed rigorous training, and sworn an oath to protect and defend. His service record from this period shows he was active duty with no apparent disciplinary issues. The military had invested time and resources into his training, expecting years of service in return. As May 1979 progressed, Jennings went through the motions of a normal visit. He had access to his aunt's home. He could come and go as he pleased. The neighborhood around his aunt's residence was quiet, filled with working families and children. Among those families living their quiet lives in Merritt Island was the Kunash family. They had no way of knowing that their world was about to collide with that of the young Marine staying with his aunt, just a short distance away. The Kunash had a little girl who loved to laugh, who was just learning to read, who had no idea that a stranger would soon steal everything from her. Her name was Rebecca. Rebecca Kunash, known to family and friends as Becky, was born on June 29, 1972. She lived with her parents, Robert and Patricia Kunash, in Merritt Island, Florida. The Kunash family resided in a quiet residential neighborhood where children could play safely and parents knew their neighbors by name. Becky was 6 years old in the spring of 1979, a first grader with her whole life ahead of her. The Kunash home was a typical single-story Florida house, modest and well-maintained, the kind of place where families put down roots and raised children. Becky had her own bedroom with a nightlight that stayed on through the night. Her parents, Robert and Patricia, were hardworking people who represented the American middle class of the late 1970s. Robert held steady employment while Patricia managed the household. They believed in hard work, community values, and giving their daughter every opportunity to succeed. Rebecca's bedroom window faced the outside of the house. Like many Florida homes, it had a screen to keep bugs out while letting fresh air in. The window could be opened from inside, but it could also be reached from outside if someone removed the screen. Nobody thought of this as a security problem. Crime was rare in this neighborhood, and trust was common. On the evening of May 10, 1979, the Kunash family followed their normal routine. Dinner, evening activities, and getting ready for bed happened just like every other night. Robert and Patricia were home, in another part of the house, as Becky settled into her bedroom. The nightlight cast its familiar glow across the room. Rebecca Kunash fell asleep in her own bed, in her own home, surrounded by the safety of her family. But when tomorrow came, Rebecca would not be there. The morning hours of May 11, 1979 were quiet across Merritt Island. Most residents slept soundly in their homes. Jennings had been staying with his aunt in the area, giving him familiarity with the neighborhood layout. At some point during that early morning, he left his aunt's home. When Jennings reached the Kunash residence, he moved to the side of the house where Rebecca's bedroom was located. Her nightlight glowed through the window, marking the room clearly from the outside. The window was at ground level, accessible to anyone standing in the yard. The screen covering the window presented only a minor obstacle. Jennings climbed through the open window into 6-year-old Rebecca's bedroom. The little girl was sleeping when he entered. He moved quickly to prevent her from screaming. Court documents state he put his hand over her mouth to silence her. The nightlight that had provided comfort now illuminated a nightmare. Rebecca was lifted from her bed. Jennings carried her to the window and took her out of her bedroom the same way he had entered. The entire abduction occurred while her parents, Robert and Patricia Kunash, remained in another room of the house. They heard nothing. They had no idea their daughter was being taken from her bed. Once outside with Rebecca, Jennings carried her to his vehicle. Jennings drove to an area near the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island. The location was secluded enough to provide privacy but still within the general area. The drive from the Kunash home to this location took only minutes. Rebecca was alone with her abductor, far from the safety of her parents and her home. The Kunash residence remained quiet. Robert and Patricia Kunash slept, believing their daughter was safe in her bed just rooms away. The Girard Street Canal area on Merritt Island provided the isolation Brian Jennings needed. Waterways cut through much of Florida, and canals like this one served drainage purposes while creating secluded spots away from residential areas. Trees and vegetation lined the banks. At night, these locations were empty of people and witnesses. Jennings parked near the canal with Rebecca. What happened next was one of the most violent crimes Brevard County had ever seen. What he did to Rebecca shocked even police officers who had seen terrible things before. Jennings raped Rebecca at the canal. After the sexual assault, Jennings picked Rebecca up by her feet and held her upside down in the air. Then he swung her downward with tremendous force, slamming her head into the ground. The impact fractured her skull. Rebecca was badly hurt, but she was still alive. He carried injured Deborah to the water. He pushed her head beneath the surface and held it there. He kept her underwater for about 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, Rebecca Kunash drowned. Rebecca died in that canal, killed by a man she had never met before that night. Jennings left Rebecca's body in the water. She remained there, submerged in the canal that had become her final resting place. Morning came to Merritt Island on May 11, 1979. Robert and Patricia Kunash began their day expecting to wake their daughter for school. Patricia went to Rebecca's bedroom to get her up. She opened the door and immediately knew something was wrong. Rebecca's bed was empty. The window stood open. The screen was gone. Patricia's immediate reaction turned from confusion to alarm. She called for Robert. Together they searched the small house, calling Rebecca's name. They checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place a 6-year-old might choose. Rebecca was not in the house. The open window and missing screen told a story that filled both parents with terror. Robert Kunash went outside to examine the window from the exterior. He found the screen lying on the ground beneath Rebecca's window. It had been carefully removed and set aside. There were shoe prints in the soft ground near the window. Someone had been there. Someone had taken their daughter. The Kunashes immediately contacted the Brevard County Sheriff's Department. Deputies responded to the residence within minutes. The scene at Rebecca's bedroom window confirmed the parents' worst fears. The evidence pointed clearly to abduction. A child had been taken from her bedroom during the night while her parents slept in another part of the house. Law enforcement began canvassing the neighborhood immediately. Deputies went door to door asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual during the night. Had anyone noticed a stranger in the area? Had anyone heard a child crying or calling for help? The responses came back negative. The abduction had occurred silently and without witnesses. The description of what was missing helped investigators understand the timeline. Rebecca had been in her bed when her parents checked on her the previous evening. She was gone by morning. The abduction had occurred sometime between approximately 9 in the evening and 7 in the morning. That gave a window of roughly 10 hours, though the actual crime likely occurred in the early morning darkness. While deputies worked the abduction scene at the Kunash home, a separate call came into the sheriff's department. A body had been discovered near the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island. The report described finding a small child's body in the water. The timing and location sent investigators' minds racing to the worst possible conclusion. Officers responded to the canal location. What they found confirmed their fears. The body of a young girl lay in the canal water. She was nude. The description matched Rebecca Kunesh. The child who had been sleeping safely in her bed hours earlier now floated in a canal, the victim of violence that investigators could only begin to piece together. The crime scene at the canal revealed the brutality Rebecca had endured. Her small body showed signs of sexual assault and massive head trauma. The medical examiner would conduct a detailed autopsy, but even the initial assessment made clear this child had suffered before she died. The cause of death appeared to be drowning, but the head injury and sexual assault painted a picture of prolonged violence. Deputies established a perimeter around the canal area. Evidence technicians photographed the scene. Rebecca's body was carefully removed from the water and transported for autopsy. Investigators collected any physical evidence from the canal bank and surrounding area. The Brevard County Sheriff's Department mobilized its homicide squad immediately. The murder of Rebecca demanded every available resource. Lead investigators, Agents Hudepohl and Porter, took command of the case. Their experience with violent crimes prepared them for difficult investigations, but few cases matched the brutality of what had been done to Rebecca Kunesh. The crime scene at the canal yielded limited physical evidence. The location was outdoors and exposed to elements. Water contaminated potential biological evidence. Still, investigators documented everything. They photographed the area from multiple angles. They searched for footprints, tire tracks, or any items the killer might have left behind. Every detail mattered. The crime scene at the Kunesh residence proved more productive. The shoe prints beneath Rebecca's window provided clear impressions. Investigators made casts of these prints. They would serve as comparison evidence once a suspect was identified. The removed window screen was collected and examined for fingerprints. Technicians dusted Rebecca's bedroom window for latent fingerprints. The results came back positive. Clear fingerprints were lifted from the windowsill. These prints belonged to whoever had opened that window from the outside. The perpetrator had left his identification at the crime scene. Now investigators needed to find whose fingers matched those prints. The autopsy confirmed Rebecca had been sexually assaulted, her skull fractured by tremendous force, and drowned while still alive. The medical evidence would be critical at trial. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood and learned that a young man in his 20s had been seen walking the area in the days before Rebecca disappeared. They discovered that Brian Frederick Jennings, a 20-year-old Marine on leave, was staying with his aunt within walking distance of the Kunesh home. Before detectives could locate him, Jennings was arrested in Orange County on May 12, 1979, just one day after Rebecca's body was found. Officers noticed his clothes and shoes were wet. His shoes matched the impressions found beneath Rebecca's bedroom window. Orange County immediately contacted Brevard County investigators. Agents Hudepohl and Porter headed to interview their suspect. The case was about to break wide open. Agents Hudepohl and Porter interviewed Jennings at the Orange County facility on May 12, 1979. After being read his Miranda rights, Jennings waived his right to an attorney and agreed to answer questions. At first, he denied any involvement, but as investigators laid out the physical evidence against him, his resolve weakened. Jennings eventually confessed to everything. He admitted seeing Rebecca through her window, removing the screen, climbing inside, and taking her from her bed. He described driving her to the canal, sexually assaulting her, slamming her head into the ground, and holding her underwater until she drowned. His confession matched the physical evidence perfectly. His fingerprints matched those on the windowsill. His shoes matched the prints beneath the window. Later, Jennings bragged about the murder to 3 different cellmates, giving investigators even more evidence. Within 24 hours of finding Rebecca's body, police had their killer in custody with a full confession. The trial began in February 1980 in Brevard County. The judge denied the defense motion to suppress Jennings' confession. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: testimony from Rebecca's parents, crime scene photos, fingerprint matches, the medical examiner's autopsy findings, cellmate testimony about Jennings bragging, and the taped confession itself. The defense offered little. A psychiatrist testified that Jennings was not insane, but had a predatory character and seriously flawed conscience. This only reinforced the prosecution's case. On February 7, 1980, the jury found Jennings guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery. The verdict was unanimous. During the penalty phase, prosecutors argued the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. A 6-year-old had been abducted, raped, had her skull fractured, and was drowned. The defense presented minimal evidence, hoping Jennings's youth might spare him. On February 11, 1980, the jury voted 11-1 for death. Judge Tom Waddell formally sentenced Jennings to death on May 7, 1980, plus 4 life sentences for the other charges. The Kunash family believed justice had been served. The defense appealed, arguing the confession should have been suppressed and that a conflict of interest had tainted the trial. In April 1982, the Florida Supreme Court reversed the conviction due to the conflict of interest. A second trial in July 1982 produced another guilty verdict and death sentence, but the Florida Supreme Court threw that out too in May 1985. The Kunash family was devastated. Their daughter's killer would face a third trial. The third trial began in March 1986, nearly 7 years after Rebecca's murder. The prosecution presented the same overwhelming evidence: the confession tape, fingerprint matches, medical examiner testimony, and cellmate statements. On April 8, 1986, the jury found Jennings guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, they recommended death by a vote of 11-1. Judge Charles Harris sentenced Jennings to death on April 25, 1986, his third death sentence for the same crime. On August 27, 1987, the Florida Supreme Court finally affirmed both the conviction and sentence. After 2 overturned convictions and 7 years of legal battles, the death sentence would stand. In 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis began signing death warrants at an unprecedented pace. By November, Florida had already executed 15 people, nearly doubling the previous state record of 8. DeSantis said justice delayed is justice denied, and he owed it to victims' families to carry out sentences that had waited decades. Critics argued the accelerated schedule overwhelmed defense attorneys and left inadequate time for legal review. Supporters said the delays had been caused by frivolous appeals and justice required carrying out lawful sentences. On October 10, 2025, Governor DeSantis signed Jennings' death warrant, scheduling his execution for November 13, 2025. Jennings' attorneys filed emergency appeals in state and federal courts. They argued he had been denied his right to counsel for years. They claimed his lupus would cause him to drown in his own blood during the lethal injection. They requested an updated clemency review. Every appeal was denied. On November 7, 2025, the Florida Supreme Court rejected all claims. On November 12, 2025, the eve of his execution, the U.S. Supreme Court denied his final petition without any noted dissents. Brian Frederick Jennings had exhausted every legal avenue. The death warrant would be carried out as scheduled. Brian Frederick Jennings woke at 4 in the morning on his final day. For his last meal, he requested a cheeseburger, French fries, and a soda. He had one visitor during the day whose identity was not disclosed. He declined to meet with a spiritual advisor. Outside Florida State Prison, about 55 protesters gathered to oppose the execution, mostly members of Our Lady of Lourdes Catholic Church from Daytona Beach. On the opposite side, a lone supporter of the death penalty played music and held signs listing the names of recently executed inmates. At 6 p.m., the curtain opened and witnesses saw Jennings strapped to the gurney with IV lines in both arms. When the warden asked if he had any final words, Jennings said, "No," loudly. He offered no apology and expressed no remorse for murdering 6-year-old Rebecca Kunash. The execution team began administering the 3-drug lethal injection. Jennings' chest heaved and his arms twitched for several minutes as the drugs took effect. Then his body went still and his mouth fell open. At 6:20 p.m., 46 years after he murdered Rebecca Kunash, Brian Frederick Jennings was pronounced dead. Prison spokesman Jordan Kirkland confirmed there were no complications. No member of Rebecca's family attended or spoke to the media. Robert Kunash had died in 2001 without seeing justice carried out. Patricia Kunash had moved out of state and chose not to attend. Jennings became Florida's 16th execution of 2025, setting a new state record. If you are finding this documentary compelling, take a moment to subscribe to No Way Out and hit that notification bell. Brian Jennings waited 46 years to face justice for what he did to Rebecca Kunash. But his story is just the beginning. 2 more executions followed in the days after his death, each with its own tragic history. Stay with us as we continue through November 2025, a month that will be remembered as one of the most significant for capital punishment in American history. Now let us continue with the next case, the case of Stephen Bryant. Stephen Bryant would face a firing squad for a 5-day killing spree that terrorized an entire community and left taunting messages written in his victims' blood. This is his story. Stephen Corey Bryant was born on April 12, 1981, in South Carolina. From his earliest years, his life was marked by difficulties that would only get worse as he grew. His mother struggled with serious substance abuse during her pregnancy, regularly drinking alcohol and using drugs while carrying him. Medical experts would later testify that this exposure before birth caused permanent damage to Bryant's developing brain, making it harder for him to think clearly and understand the results of his actions. Bryant's childhood was filled with trauma and chaos. Before he reached his teenage years, he was sexually abused by multiple male relatives. The abuse started when he was just 6 years old and went on for years. A preacher's wife and several women in his neighborhood also abused him during this time. These experiences left deep psychological wounds that Bryant would carry into adulthood. The damage from his childhood showed up early. Bryant struggled in school, displaying signs of low mental and emotional ability from elementary school onward. Teachers documented his problems in his records. When he was just 11 years old, Bryant was placed in the juvenile justice system for the first time. This early intervention failed to help him or provide the mental health treatment he desperately needed. As Bryant grew into a teenager and young adult, he turned to drugs to escape the memories of his childhood abuse. He regularly used methamphetamine, marijuana sprayed with Raid insecticide, and dangerous amounts of Benadryl. These substances further damaged his already injured brain. Bryant's first serious brush with the law came when he was in his late teens. By the time he was 19 years old, he had begun committing burglaries. In the early 2000s, he was arrested and convicted of burglary, receiving an 18-month prison sentence. He served his time and was released on probation, but the experience failed to rehabilitate him or address his underlying issues. After his release from prison, Bryant returned to Sumter County and tried to build a life. He found work as a carpenter with a local construction company owned by Garris Varney. Bryant was described by his employer and co-workers as generally pleasant and hardworking when he showed up for work. However, his performance was inconsistent. He struggled with poor attendance and had difficulty maintaining the standards expected of him. In 2003, Bryant was fired from the construction company due to his poor attitude and work performance. The loss of this job was another setback in his already troubled life. Despite being unemployed, Bryant remained in the Sumter County area, living with his girlfriend in Wedgefield at the Wiles Mobile Home Park on Eagle Road. He continued to struggle with drug addiction and mental health issues, and his financial situation grew increasingly desperate. By the fall of 2004, Bryant was still on probation from his earlier burglary conviction. He was supposed to be checking in with probation officers and staying out of trouble, but he was spiraling. In September 2004, the memories of his childhood sexual abuse became overwhelming. Bryant sought help from a probation officer and told his grandmother and aunt about the abuse he had suffered. He explained that 3 men in his family had sexually abused him and that the memories were tormenting him. In the weeks leading up to October 2004, Bryant's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He was 23 years old and had already spent 4 of the last 5 years in prison. The trauma from his childhood continued to haunt him, and he could no longer suppress the memories. He turned to drugs with increased frequency, using methamphetamine and marijuana sprayed with insecticide in an attempt to forget what had happened to him. Recognizing that he needed help, Bryant attempted to seek professional mental health counseling. He approached mental health facilities in the Sumter area, explaining that he was experiencing severe psychological distress related to childhood trauma. However, he was turned away. The reason was simple but devastating. Bryant could not afford to pay for treatment. Without insurance or the funds to cover the cost of therapy, the facilities refused to provide him with care. The denial of mental health services left Bryant alone with his demons. His drug use increased as he tried to self-medicate. He became increasingly paranoid and impulsive. By early October 2004, Bryant had made a decision. Whether consciously or subconsciously, he had decided that he would commit a series of crimes. For several days before he acted, he drove his distinctive blue and white pickup truck through the rural areas of Sumter County, looking for opportunities. He was methodically casing homes, particularly those that were isolated and far from the main roads. Bryant's approach was calculated. He would drive up to isolated homes during midday hours, when residents might be home alone. He developed cover stories to explain his presence. Sometimes he claimed he was looking for someone and had gotten lost. Other times, he said his truck had broken down or overheated and he needed help. On October 4, 2004, Bryant visited the home of Tom Dennis, which sat on several hundred acres of property far back from the road. Bryant used the story about his brother and his stolen truck. Dennis, being neighborly, helped Bryant with what appeared to be a genuine problem and thought nothing more of the interaction. He had no way of knowing that Bryant was sizing up his property and planning to return. On October 5, 2004, Bryant put his plan into action. He returned to Tom Dennis's property and broke into the home office while no one was there. The burglary was methodical. Bryant went through the office looking for valuables and anything that might be useful for what he had planned next. He stole electronics, cash, and other items before leaving the property. The success of this first burglary emboldened Bryant. He had proven to himself that he could break into homes in the area without being caught. The isolated nature of the properties and the trusting character of the rural community worked in his favor. Neighbors were accustomed to seeing unfamiliar vehicles on the dirt roads, and people helping each other with car trouble or directions was common. 3 days later, on Friday, October 8, 2004, Bryant committed a second burglary. This time he targeted the home of James Ammons. Bryant broke into the house while no one was home, and this burglary was more purposeful than the first. Before entering, he cut the phone wires to the house, ensuring that no one inside could call for help if they returned unexpectedly. This showed planning and an understanding of how to neutralize potential threats. Inside the Ammons home, Bryant found what he was looking for: a .40 caliber Smith & Wesson handgun along with ammunition. He stole the weapon and other valuables before leaving the property. Now armed, Bryant was ready for the next phase of his crime spree. The gun would be used in every shooting that followed over the next 5 days, and ballistics tests would later confirm that all 4 shootings were connected to this single weapon. Later that same day, Friday, October 8, 2004, Bryant took the stolen gun and drove to the Wateree River, which forms part of the border between Sumter County and Richland County. The river was a popular spot for fishing, and on this particular afternoon, 56-year-old Clinton Brown was enjoying a peaceful day by the water. Brown was a regular fisherman who knew the area well and often came to this spot. Bryant approached the riverbank where Brown was fishing. What happened next demonstrated the cold-blooded nature of what was to come. Without warning or provocation, Bryant raised the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson and shot Brown in the back. The bullet struck Brown while he was facing away from his attacker, giving him no chance to defend himself or even understand what was happening. The shot was meant to kill, but Brown was remarkably tough. Despite being seriously wounded, he managed to remain conscious and functional. With the bullet still in his back, Brown got himself to his vehicle. Instead of collapsing or waiting for help that might never come, he drove himself to Tuomi Hospital in Sumter, where he received emergency treatment for his injuries. The medical staff worked quickly to stabilize him and treat the gunshot wound. On Saturday, October 9, 2004, Bryant turned his attention to someone he knew personally. Clifton Gainey was a 36-year-old man who had once worked alongside Bryant at Varney Construction. Despite Bryant's firing from the company for poor performance, he and Gainey had maintained a friendship. They went on fishing trips together and spent time with each other's families. Gainey considered Bryant a friend, never suspecting the danger that friendship would bring. Gainey had moved to Sumter County just over a year earlier from Cheraw, South Carolina. His primary reason for relocating was to be closer to his two sons, Christopher and Michael, who meant everything to him. Gainey also had two stepdaughters from a previous relationship. His family described him as a good-hearted person who loved his children deeply and would never harm anyone. He was a simple man who worked hard, enjoyed fishing, and valued his relationships with friends and family. That Saturday afternoon, Bryant picked up Gainey, and the two men drove to a convenience store together to buy beer and steaks. Witnesses later recalled seeing Bryant and Gainey together at the store, with no signs of conflict between them. They appeared to be two friends heading out for an afternoon of leisure. After leaving the store, Bryant suggested they go for a drive through the rural dirt roads of Sumter County, and Gainey agreed. Bryant drove his blue and white pickup truck along Bells Mill Road, a dirt road that wound through isolated wooded areas. At some point during the drive, Bryant pulled over, and both men got out of the vehicle. Gainey walked to the side of the road to relieve himself, turning his back to Bryant. In that vulnerable moment, Bryant raised the stolen handgun and shot his friend in the back. Gainey reacted instinctively to the gunshot, raising his hand to shield his face as he turned toward his attacker. But Bryant fired again, this time shooting Gainey in the head at close range. The second shot was fatal. Gainey collapsed on the side of Bells Mill Road, and Bryant left his body there. He got back into his truck, taking with him the steaks that he and Gainey had just purchased together. Bryant was not finished with his betrayal of his former friend. He drove from the murder scene directly to Gainey's rented mobile home. Over the past year, Gainey had worked hard to make a life for himself in Sumter County, and his trailer reflected his modest but comfortable existence. Bryant broke into the home and systematically ransacked it, stealing electronics, an aquarium, and anything else of value he could find. After looting his dead friend's home, Bryant committed one final act of destruction. He set fire to Gainey's trailer, ensuring that the evidence of his burglary would be destroyed and that Gainey's home would be reduced to ashes. The fire department responded to the blaze, but by the time they arrived, the damage was extensive. The trailer that Gainey had called home was largely destroyed. Around 7 o'clock that evening, witnesses discovered Gainey's body on Bells Mill Road. They reported seeing a blue and white pickup truck driving away from the area, but they were too far away to identify the driver or get a clear license plate number. Law enforcement responded to the scene and quickly determined that Gainey had been murdered. The body had not been there at 6:30, meaning the killing had occurred within the last half hour. Investigators believed Gainey knew his killer, given the circumstances of the shooting. The discovery of Clifton Gainey's body sent shockwaves through the Sumter County community. Within days, residents of the rural area east of Columbia were dealing with multiple violent crimes. First, there had been the shooting of Clinton Brown at the Wateree River on Friday. Now on Saturday evening, Gainey's body had been found on a dirt road and his trailer had burned. The proximity of these crimes and the similar circumstances suggested they might be related. On Monday, October 11, 2004, Bryant targeted his most carefully planned and brutal murder. 62-year-old Willard Irving Tietjen Jr., known as TJ to his friends and family, lived in an isolated ranch-style home in the Wedgefield area of Sumter County. The house sat on Kane Savannah Road, far from neighbors and surrounded by rural countryside. Tietjen was a retired U.S. Air Force sergeant who had spent his career stationed around the world, from the Philippines and Germany to Thailand and Oregon. Tietjen was a devoted father, grandfather, and husband. He had been married to Mildred Carol Carstensen for 39 years, having met her in December 1964 on a blind date when he was stationed in Iowa. They married just 3 months later, in March 1965, and built a life together through his various military postings. After his retirement from the Air Force, Tietjen settled in South Carolina, where he could enjoy his hobbies and spend time with his family, particularly his daughter, Kimberly Sue Dees, and her husband, Robert, who lived in Sumter. Tietjen had instilled important values in his daughter throughout her life. He took her to plays and concerts, taught her to fish and hunt, showed her how to roller skate, and helped her appreciate nature and respect her country. Most importantly, he taught her about the value of life itself. As Kimberly would later testify, her father believed that all life has value and that everyone is part of God's creation. He was a man who lived his principles and treated others with kindness and respect. That Monday afternoon, Bryant approached Tietjen's home. He used his tried and tested cover story, telling Tietjen that his truck had overheated and he needed help. Tietjen, being a helpful and trusting person, invited Bryant into his home. The two men talked for hours. Bryant gained Tietjen's confidence, and the older man had no reason to suspect that the young man in his home was a killer. As the afternoon wore on, Bryant made his move. He pulled out the stolen .40 caliber Smith & Wesson and shot Willard Tietjen. But unlike his previous victims, Bryant did not simply shoot Tietjen once or twice. He shot the 62-year-old man 9 times, ensuring that there was no possibility of survival. The overkill suggested rage, paranoia, or perhaps a desire to ensure the victim could not identify him. After murdering Tietjen, Bryant did not immediately flee the scene. Instead, he settled in for an extended period of time in the dead man's home. He walked through the house, ransacking it room by room, looking for valuables to steal. He took jewelry off Tietjen's finger, including his ring. He gathered power tools, electronics, and other items he could sell. The burglary was thorough and methodical, showing no signs of panic or remorse. Bryant then did something that demonstrated a disturbing comfort with what he had done. He sat down at Tietjen's computer and used it to browse the internet. He smoked cigarettes and cigars that he found in the house, relaxing as if he were in his own home rather than at a murder scene. At some point during this time, Bryant took a cigarette and used it to burn Tietjen's face and eyes. The torture served no practical purpose. It was an act of sadism that would later help convince prosecutors and the court that Bryant's crimes were not simply impulsive acts, but calculated acts of cruelty. As Bryant remained in the house, Tietjen's wife Mildred and his daughter Kimberly both tried repeatedly to reach him by phone. Tietjen was usually reliable about answering his cell phone, and when he didn't pick up, his family grew concerned. They called again and again, hoping each time that he would answer. Around 5:30 in the evening, someone finally picked up Tietjen's cell phone. But it wasn't Tietjen. When Mildred Tietjen called her husband's cell phone and someone answered, she was initially relieved, but her relief instantly turned to horror when she heard an unfamiliar voice. The man on the other end of the line identified himself as the Prowler and delivered devastating news. TJ was dead. Mildred was stunned. The casual cruelty of the statement was almost incomprehensible. This stranger had murdered her husband and was now taunting her with the information. Shortly after Mildred's call, Kimberly Dees tried her father's number. This was the 6th time she had called, and with each unanswered call, her worry had increased. When someone finally picked up, she immediately asked to speak to her father. The voice on the other end said, "I'm having a wonderful day. How are you?" The cheerful tone was grotesque given what had happened. When Kimberly insisted on speaking to her father, the voice replied, "You can't. I killed him." Kimberly refused to believe what she was hearing. "This isn't funny. Who are you?" she demanded. The voice responded, "I'm the Prowler." She asked again, "Excuse me, who are you?" The voice repeated, "I'm the Prowler." The conversation was brief but would haunt Kimberly for the rest of her life. The man who had killed her father had taken the time to answer his phone and personally inform his family of what he had done. It was an act of psychological torture that went beyond the physical murder. Before leaving THN's home, Bryant engaged in one more act of sadism. He found a potholder that Kimberly had made for her father when she was a child. Bryant dipped the potholder into THN's blood and used it to smear a message on the wall. Victim 4 in 2 weeks. Catch me if you can. The misspelling of victim and the taunting challenge to law enforcement showed both Bryant's limited education and his desire to provoke authorities. He left additional notes around the crime scene, including one on the table that read, "Good luck finding me, LMFAO," and another in a manila envelope placed on THN's chest. "I am the light. I am so bright. I am the sun. Yours truly, the Prowler." On the evening of October 11, 2004, Major Gary Metz of the Sumter County Sheriff's Office received a call from THN's family. They had received disturbing phone calls from someone claiming to be at THN's home, and they feared something terrible had happened. Deputies were dispatched to the residence on Kane-Savannah Road to conduct a welfare check. When they arrived at the isolated property, they found evidence that something was very wrong. The house had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled open, belongings were scattered, and valuables were clearly missing. As deputies moved through the home, they discovered Willard THN's body. He had been shot 9 times. His face and eyes showed evidence of cigarette burns. Lit candles had been placed around his body in a macabre display. The crime scene was one of the most disturbing that veteran investigators had encountered. On the walls, deputies found the taunting messages written in blood. The reference to victim 4 in 2 weeks was particularly chilling because it suggested that the killer had committed other murders recently and was planning more. The message, "Catch me if you can," was a direct challenge to law enforcement. At a press conference the following day, Sheriff Tommy Mims addressed this taunt directly, telling reporters and the community. At the THN residence, he left a message on the wall that challenged law enforcement, "Catch me if you can." And I'm happy to say that law enforcement has responded to that challenge. Deputies immediately recognized potential connections between THN's murder and the recent violence in the area. Clinton Brown had been shot just 3 days earlier. Clifton Gainey's body had been found on Saturday. Now THN was dead on Monday. All the crimes had occurred within a 5-mile radius in rural Sumter County. All involved shootings with what appeared to be the same caliber weapon. Ballistics tests would soon confirm that all 4 shootings were connected. On Wednesday morning, October 13, 2004, 35-year-old Christopher Earl Burgess stopped at a convenience store in Sumter County. Burgess had arrived on his motorcycle, which he often rode around the area. Inside the store, he encountered Stephen Bryant. What transpired between them is unknown, but witnesses later reported that the 2 men appeared to strike up a conversation. The store clerk watched as Burgess and Bryant walked outside together. Outside the convenience store, Burgess and Bryant loaded Burgess's motorcycle into the back of Bryant's blue and white pickup truck. The clerk observed this through the store window and remembered it later when investigators came asking questions. The 2 men then drove off together, heading out into the rural roads that crisscross the countryside east of Columbia. For Burgess, this decision to accept a ride from Bryant would be fatal. Bryant drove along isolated dirt roads, similar to where he had killed Clifton Gainey. At some point during the drive, Bryant stopped the truck, and both men got out. Like Gainey before him, Burgess walked to the side of the road, perhaps to relieve himself, or simply to stretch his legs. And like Gainey, he turned his back to Bryant. In that moment of vulnerability, Bryant raised the stolen .40 caliber Smith & Wesson and fired. Bryant shot Burgess twice, once in the chest and once in the head. The shots were fatal. Bryant left Burgess's body on the side of the dirt road near the Manchester State Forest and drove away with Burgess's motorcycle still in the back of his truck. A hunter passing through the area later that morning discovered the body and immediately called law enforcement. Deputies responded to the scene and found Burgess lying on the rural road, the third murder victim in less than a week. By Wednesday, October 13, 2004, law enforcement had connected the evidence. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a blue and white pickup truck near the crime scenes. Debbie Durant had written down the license plate. The convenience store clerk saw Burgess leave with a man driving a similar truck. Deputies traced the plate to Stephen Bryant, age 23, who had a criminal record for burglary and was on probation. His former employment with Clifton Gainey provided a direct link to one of the murders. Deputies arrested Bryant at his girlfriend's home that afternoon. He surrendered peacefully. A search turned up items stolen from Tietjen's home and the .40 caliber Smith & Wesson used in all 4 shootings. Bryant confessed during questioning, admitting to the burglaries, shootings, murders, and arson. He claimed his victims had threatened him, but investigators found no evidence of this. All victims had been shot while defenseless. On October 14, 2004, Bryant was charged with 3 counts of murder, plus burglary, assault, arson, armed robbery, and weapons charges. The community felt relief that the killer was caught, but shock that someone many described as nice could commit such horrific crimes. 3 families were left devastated. Clifton Gainey's sons lost the father, who had moved to Sumter just to be near them. Willard Tietjen's wife and daughter had both spoken to his killer on the phone, hearing him taunt them. Tietjen's 5-year-old grandson tried to comfort his mother, promising to stay with her so nobody could murder her. The families petitioned for financial aid to cover funeral expenses while the community rallied around them. While awaiting trial, Bryant continued his violent behavior. In October 2005, he attacked a correctional officer, punching him repeatedly until the officer collapsed. He also threw urine at another inmate. These incidents reinforced expert assessments that Bryant was impulsive, antisocial, and posed a continuing threat even behind bars. In August 2008, Bryant pled guilty to all 3 murders and 9 other charges with no plea deal. The judge would now decide his fate. The defense presented extensive mitigating evidence about his childhood sexual abuse, prenatal brain damage, and mental health diagnoses, including PTSD, ADD, and chronic depression. His aunt described seeing him tortured by memories in the months before the killings. On September 11, 2008, Judge Thomas Russo sentenced Bryant to death for the murder of Willard Tietjen, plus 2 life sentences for the other murders, and 100 additional years for other crimes. The judge acknowledged Bryant was deeply troubled, but found the aggravating factors outweighed the mitigation. The brutality of Tietjen's murder, the taunting of his family, and the messages written in blood demonstrated cruelty that warranted the ultimate punishment. Bryant spent 17 years on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution, where he continued to show violent behavior, including a 2009 fight and possessing a weapon in 2023. His appeals were rejected at every level. On January 28, 2025, the Fourth Circuit rejected claims of intellectual disability. On October 14, 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to review his case. Bryant had exhausted his appeals. On October 17, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court signed a death warrant for Stephen Bryant, setting his execution date for November 14, 2025. Under South Carolina state law, prisoners facing execution were allowed to choose their preferred method: firing squad, lethal injection, or electric chair. If they failed to choose by the deadline of October 31, 2025, they would be executed by electric chair by default. Bryant chose the firing squad, becoming the 3rd inmate in South Carolina to select this method since the state resumed executions in 2024. Bryant's attorneys filed a final appeal to the South Carolina Supreme Court on November 6, 2025, seeking to stay the execution. They argued that Bryant's criminal conduct was a result of his mother's alcohol and drug use during pregnancy, which had caused him brain damage that affected his ability to be a law-abiding citizen. They presented newly discovered evidence and argued that the trial judge had never fully considered the extent of Bryant's developmental disabilities. The prosecution responded that Bryant's murderous and sadistic actions were deliberate acts of evil, and he was methodical, cunning, and took pleasure in his deadly rampage. On November 11, 2025, the South Carolina Supreme Court rejected Bryant's final appeal in a unanimous decision. The justices wrote, "By any stretch, Bryant demonstrated a high level of planning, decision-making, and calculation in committing his crimes." They concluded that even if his defense had done more investigation into fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, it would have simply provided a different reason for his problems, while not changing the outcome of a death sentence. On Wednesday, November 13, 2025, Bryant ate his final meal. His request included spicy mixed seafood stir-fry over rice, fried fish over rice, 2 egg rolls, 3 stuffed shrimp, duck and soy sauce, 2 Zero candy bars, German chocolate cake, and 2 Pepsis. It was an elaborate Asian-themed meal that he consumed on Wednesday evening, giving him one last night to prepare for what awaited him the following day. On Friday, November 14, 2025, Stephen Bryant was taken to the death chamber at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia. When media witnesses arrived and the curtain was drawn, Bryant was already strapped to the execution chair. His feet were shackled, his arms were strapped behind him and to the chair, and his head was restrained by a sling around his chin. He wore a black jumpsuit and mittens over his hands. A small white target with a red bullseye was affixed to his chest, marking the location of his heart. 10 witnesses were present for the execution, including 3 family members of Bryant's victims who held hands throughout the procedure. Also present were one of Bryant's attorneys, representatives from the Third Circuit Solicitor's Office, and the Sumter County Sheriff's Department. Bryant briefly glanced toward the witnesses but did not react to their presence. He made no final statement. His breathing remained normal as guards prepared for the execution. At 6 o'clock in the evening, guards placed a hood over Bryant's head. About 1 minute later, they raised the shade separating the death chamber from the room where 3 volunteer prison employees stood with their weapons. At 6:02 p.m., the marksman fired simultaneously from 15 feet away. The impact sent the bullseye target flying off Bryant's chest. A pool of wetness emerged where the bullets had struck. Bryant made no sound when the bullets hit him. He appeared to take several more shallow breaths, then experienced a single spasm about a minute after he was shot. A doctor examined Bryant with a stethoscope for approximately 1 minute before pronouncing him dead at 6:05 p.m. Stephen Corey Bryant, who had killed 3 people over 8 days in October 2004, was dead at age 44. Outside the prison, a small group of death penalty protesters had gathered to bear witness and speak against the execution. Bo King, one of Bryant's attorneys, released a statement following the execution. He noted that Bryant's final wish was that no one else would face rejection when seeking mental health support due to inability to pay, as Bryant had experienced. King described Bryant as someone who showed grace and courage in forgiving his family and great love for those in and outside of his prison, adding that they would remember his unlikely friendships, his fierce protectiveness, and his love for nature, the water, and the world. Bryant was the 7th person executed in South Carolina since the state resumed capital punishment in September 2024 after a 13-year hiatus. He was the 3rd person executed by firing squad in South Carolina in 2025, following Brad Sigmund and Michael Motti. He was the 43rd person executed in the United States in 2025, a year that would see 44 executions total, the highest number since 2012. Bryant was also only the 6th person executed by firing squad in the modern era of American capital punishment since 1976. Stephen Bryant's execution by firing squad on November 14, 2025, brought a measure of closure to the families of Clifton Gainey, Willard Teachin, and Christopher Burgess. But the week of executions was not over. 6 days later, Florida would carry out its 17th execution of the year. The man scheduled to die had spent 37 years on death row for a crime committed in 1988. His story began not with violence, but with a teenage girl in 1963 who was forced to make an impossible choice. On January 3, 1963, in a municipal hospital in Queens, New York, a 17-year-old girl gave birth to a baby boy. She named him Barry. He had curly hair and brown eyes, and when she held him, she felt a connection she knew she would never be allowed to keep. Sandra came from a respected, church-going, middle-class family in the South. When she told her parents she was pregnant, they were dismayed. This was the early 1960s, when getting pregnant out of wedlock while still in high school carried enormous stigma. Sandra was an outstanding student, a top basketball player, and lead clarinetist in her school band. She had ambitions for college and a future career. Her parents were firm in their decision that the baby should be given up for adoption, and Sandra, who was not willing to fight them, agreed. The family kept the pregnancy a secret from their community. They sent Sandra to New York City to give birth, far from anyone who knew them. She stayed at a home for unwed mothers, a place where young women like her waited out their pregnancies away from judgmental eyes. When the baby was born, Sandra held him and looked at his face, trying to memorize features she believed she would never see again. She told herself that giving him up for adoption was the best thing she could do for him. She believed he would be placed with loving parents who could give him the stable life he deserved, the life she could not provide as an unwed teenager. A few weeks after the birth, Sandra signed the adoption papers and returned to her family in the South. She was expected to move on with her life as if nothing had happened. But Sandra never stopped thinking about her son. As the years passed and she built a successful career as an international banker, married a loving husband, and created a new life for herself, she wondered what had become of the curly-haired baby she had named Barry. For 50 years she searched for him, hoping that one day the adoption records would be opened and she could learn what had happened to the child she had been forced to give away. At 5 months old, the baby Sandra had given up for adoption was placed with a couple in New York. His new adoptive parents worked respectable jobs. His adoptive father drove a cab, and his adoptive mother worked at an insurance company. They had been thrilled to bring a baby home, finally able to start the family they had longed for. On paper, they appeared to be the kind of stable, middle-class family that adoption agencies sought for children in need of homes. Behind closed doors, however, the household was anything but stable. From the very beginning, the baby who would be named Richard Barry Randolph struggled emotionally. He had trouble sleeping and threw what his parents called temper tantrums. He bit his fingers and hands compulsively, displaying signs of distress that his adoptive parents were not equipped to address. The trauma that stems from adoption, particularly the separation from a biological mother, even in infancy, was not as well understood in the 1960s as it would later become. As Richard grew from an infant into a toddler and then a young child, the dysfunction in his adoptive home became more pronounced. His adoptive mother battled severe alcoholism and mental illness. She was hospitalized repeatedly for psychiatric care, leaving Richard without consistent maternal presence or nurturing. When she was home, she often told him he was worthless. The message was clear. He was unwanted, he did not matter, and he was a burden to the people who were supposed to love him. His adoptive father responded to the chaos in the household with violence. He beat Richard with belts, broomsticks, and his closed fists. Sometimes, as punishment for misbehavior or simply out of anger, he would lock Richard in dark closets for days at a time. The physical abuse was severe and constant, creating an environment where the child lived in perpetual fear. No one celebrated his birthdays. When Richard was around 10 years old, his adoptive parents made a decision that would profoundly impact his sense of identity and belonging. Following the guidance of a book recommended by their adoption agency, they told Richard that he was adopted. The revelation was delivered without the emotional support or context that a child needed to process such life-altering information. For Richard, learning that he had been given away by his biological parents confirmed what he had already internalized from years of abuse and neglect. He was unwanted. The knowledge that his birth parents had given him up, combined with the ongoing abuse from his adoptive parents, created a deep psychological wound. Richard struggled to understand why he had been abandoned. He could not know that his birth mother had been a teenager, forced by her parents to give him up, that she had believed she was giving him a better life, or that she would spend the rest of her life wondering what had become of him. All he knew was that no one had wanted him enough to keep him. His adoptive parents divorced when Richard was 10 years old, adding another layer of instability to his already chaotic life. By this age, Richard was already showing signs of severe emotional disturbance. He was medicated for his psychological problems, an early acknowledgement that the trauma he had experienced required intervention. However, the medication did not address the root causes of his distress, and the psychological trauma he had suffered was never truly treated. As Richard moved through his childhood and into adolescence, he carried the weight of abandonment, abuse, and a deep sense of worthlessness. He struggled in school, not just academically, but also socially and emotionally. He had difficulty forming healthy attachments to others, a common outcome for children who have experienced early trauma and unstable caregiving. The foundation of his personality was built on chaos, violence, and the belief that he did not deserve love or stability. At 18, Richard enlisted in the United States Army, seeking the structure and belonging he had never experienced. For a time, military life gave him purpose. He served honorably, followed orders, and completed his duties. He was no longer the unwanted child from a chaotic home, but a soldier, serving his nation. However, the Army could not heal his psychological wounds. The trauma from his childhood remained untreated. Richard began using drugs and alcohol to cope with his inner pain. By the time he received his honorable discharge, he had developed a serious substance abuse problem. Richard moved to North Carolina, where he met Norma Janine Betts. She described him as a nice young man with a job who seemed to be building a normal life. They had a daughter together, and for a brief time, it looked like Richard might create the stable family he never had. Then they moved to Palatka, Florida, a small rural city of about 11,000 people. Richard fell in with the wrong crowd, and his substance abuse escalated dramatically. He became addicted to crack cocaine. The addiction destroyed everything. He lost jobs, his relationship with Betts fell apart, and he could not provide for his daughter. The drug offered temporary escape from his childhood pain, but made him paranoid and desperate. The structure he had found in the military was gone, replaced by chaos. It was in this state of addiction and desperation that Richard's path would cross with a woman who represented everything he was not. While Richard's life spiraled downward, Minnie Ruth McCollum had spent decades building something stable and meaningful in the same small community. Minnie Ruth McCollum was 62 years old in August 1988. She had been married to her husband for 47 years, having built a long and stable life together. They had one son, though both her son and her husband would die before her, leaving her without the family she had built over nearly 5 decades. Despite these losses, Minnie kept working and stayed connected to her community. She had become a well-known figure in the small community of East Palatka, where she managed the Handyway convenience store on State Road 207. The Handyway was more than just a workplace for Minnie. It was where she connected with her community daily. When you work in a small convenience store in a town like Palatka, everyone gets to know everyone. Minnie arrived at the store every morning at 5:30, a full half hour before the 6 o'clock opening time. She used those 30 minutes to prepare for the day, checking the gas pumps outside and making sure everything was ready for the customers who would start arriving as soon as the doors opened. Minnie's routine was predictable, which made her a reliable presence in the lives of her regular customers. Every morning, she would unlock the store, turn on the lights, and head outside to prepare the gas pumps before customers started arriving. It was a routine she had followed for years, and she had no reason to believe that August 15, 1988 would be any different from any other day. By August 1988, Richard Barry Randolph was 27 years old and desperate. His crack cocaine addiction had left him in constant need of money to feed his habit. He was unemployed and struggling to support himself and contribute to the care of his daughter. The chaos that had defined his childhood had returned in full force, and he was making increasingly poor decisions driven by addiction and desperation. Richard knew the Handyway convenience store well because he had once worked there. Minnie Ruth McCollum had been his manager during his employment. He knew the store's layout, its security procedures, and the daily routines of the staff. Most importantly, he knew that there was approximately $1,000 kept in the store's safe. Money that represented deposits not yet taken to the bank. For someone in Richard's state of addiction-driven desperation, that $1,000 seemed like the solution to his immediate problems. Richard developed a plan to rob the Handyway. He knew that Minnie arrived at 5:30 in the morning and spent time outside preparing the gas pumps before the store officially opened at 6. His plan was to sneak into the store while she was outside, access the safe, take the money, and leave before she returned. It seemed simple. He had been an employee, so he knew where everything was. He could be in and out before Minnie even knew anyone had been inside. On the morning of August 15, 1988, Richard put his plan into action. He armed himself with a toy gun, thinking it might be useful if he needed to threaten anyone, though he hoped to avoid confrontation entirely. He rode his bicycle to the Handyway, arriving in the early morning hours when the streets were quiet. He hid the toy gun behind the store and waited for Minnie to follow her usual routine. Minnie Ruth McCollum arrived at the Handyway at her usual time of 5:30 on the morning of August 15, 1988. She unlocked the store and began her morning routine. True to her habits, she went outside to prepare the gas pumps for the day's customers. Richard Randolph, watching from his hiding spot, saw his opportunity. He entered the store through the unlocked door and made his way to the safe. This was supposed to be the easy part. Open the safe, take the money, and leave before Minnie returned. But Richard could not get the safe open. He struggled with it, trying different approaches, growing increasingly frustrated and anxious. The minutes ticked by as he worked at the safe, and then the thing he had hoped to avoid happened. Minnie returned from outside much sooner than he had anticipated. She walked into the store and saw Richard at the safe. The two made eye contact, and in that moment, Richard's simple robbery plan fell apart completely. A struggle ensued. Richard began hitting Minnie with his fists, trying to make her stop struggling and quiet down. He kicked her repeatedly. But Minnie fought back, struggling against him, moving and making noise. Every time Richard thought he had subdued her enough to return to the safe, she would begin to move again or cry out. His paranoia and desperation increasing, Richard became more violent. He took the drawstring out of his hooded sweatshirt and used it to strangle Minnie until she stopped moving. Richard Randolph returned to the safe, still trying to access the money that had brought him to the Handyway that morning. But he could not open it. The safe remained locked, mocking his increasingly desperate attempts. As he worked at the safe, he heard movement from the back room. Minnie Ruth McCollum, despite the beating and strangulation she had endured, was still alive. She began to scream. Richard rushed back to the back room and hit Minnie again, trying to silence her. When she quieted down, he returned to the safe. But again, he heard noise from the back room. Minnie was moving again, making sounds that indicated she was still conscious. Richard's actions became more extreme. He found a small knife and stabbed Minnie multiple times, including a wound to the area near her left eye and lacerations to the left side of her neck. He strangled her again with the drawstring from his sweatshirt. Throughout this prolonged attack, Richard took multiple breaks to continue working on the safe. He would assault Minnie until she appeared to be subdued, then return to the safe, then go back to the back room when she made more noise. The attack was not a single violent explosion, but rather a sustained pattern of violence, interrupted by his continued attempts to access money. Prosecutors would later note that this showed the calculated nature of his actions, even in the midst of violence. At some point during this horrific morning, Richard made a decision. that he would later admit was intended to mislead investigators. He raped Minnie Ruth McCollum. This calculated decision in the midst of a brutal assault demonstrated a level of planning that would later work against him at trial. Having failed to open the safe despite his prolonged efforts, Richard Barry Randolph finally gave up on getting the $1,000 that had been his original objective. Instead, he grabbed what he could: lottery tickets that he found in the store. He put on a Handyway employee smock, the same type he had worn when he worked there, perhaps thinking it would help him blend in or provide some cover for his escape. He then began working to cover his tracks. Richard ripped the security camera from its mount on the ceiling. The camera, which would have recorded his presence in the store and his actions, was pulled down and stuffed into a trash can along with the dangling wires. He tipped the trash can over in the process. The area behind the counter was left in disarray, with clear signs that something violent had occurred. Richard took Minnie's car keys from wherever she had left them and prepared to leave. Before departing, Richard returned to the back room one more time to check on Minnie. She was lying on her back, naked from the waist down due to the sexual assault. Blood was coming from the back of her head and neck. She was barely breathing, making slight moaning sounds that indicated she was still clinging to life despite the savage beating, strangulation, stabbing, and sexual assault she had endured. Richard left her there, certain that she would die from her injuries. Shortly after 7 o'clock on the morning of August 15, 1988, Richard prepared to leave the store. He locked the front door from the inside, then headed toward another exit. But just as he was about to escape, he encountered an unexpected problem. Terry Sorrell, a regular customer at the Handyway, had arrived at the store expecting to find it open as usual. Instead, he found the door locked. This was unusual, as Minnie was always punctual about opening at 6. At almost the same time, Dorothy and Deborah Patilla, who worked as custodians at the store, also arrived. They too found the locked door puzzling. As they stood outside, wondering what was going on, Richard Randolph emerged from the store wearing a Handyway employee smock. The women asked him where Minnie was and why the store was locked. Richard, thinking quickly, told them a story. Minnie's car had broken down, he explained, and she had taken his car. He had repaired her car and was now leaving to pick her up. The explanation seemed plausible enough, though the women found it odd. Richard got into Minnie's car and drove away. After Richard left, the women's concern grew. Something did not feel right about the situation. They tried the door again and, finding it still locked, peered through the window to see if they could spot Minnie inside. What they saw alarmed them. The security camera was pulled down from the ceiling, with wires coming out of the trash can, which had been tipped over. The area behind the counter was in complete disarray. The door to the back room, which was normally kept open, was almost completely closed. It was clear that something was very wrong. The women immediately called the police. Deputies from the Putnam County Sheriff's Office responded quickly to the report of suspicious circumstances at the Handyway. When they arrived, they had to break a window to gain entry to the locked store. Inside, they made their way to the back room, pushed open the almost closed door, and found Minnie Ruth McCollum lying on the floor. She was on her back, naked from the waist down, with blood coming from the back of her head and neck. She was breathing shallowly and moaning slightly, barely clinging to life. A knife lay beside her head. Paramedics rushed Minnie to the hospital, where Dr. Kirby Bland found her comatose, with her head massively beaten. Her injuries were extensive: multiple lacerations on her scalp, face, and neck, a fractured jawbone, knife wounds to her neck that caused bleeding around her heart, and a stab wound near her left eye. Neurologist Dr. Albert Roten Jr. said that in 20 years of practice, he had never seen brain swelling so severe. He compared it to injuries from a high-speed car accident. Medical examiners documented 334 bruises covering her body, evidence of a prolonged assault rather than a brief attack. Minnie had suffered for an extended period as Richard repeatedly beat her, left to work on the safe, then returned to beat her again whenever she made noise. After leaving the Handyway in Minnie's car, Richard drove to his girlfriend Bet's and admitted he had robbed the store and attacked Minnie. He said he was going to Jacksonville to cash the stolen lottery tickets and borrow money, then would return to take Bet's and their daughter to North Carolina. Richard never made it back. He was arrested at a grocery store in Jacksonville while waiting for money. Detective William Horde questioned him, and Richard gave a detailed confession. He described planning the robbery, hiding the toy gun behind the building, and knowing Minnie's routine. He admitted to dragging her to the back room, beating her repeatedly, strangling her with his sweatshirt drawstring, and stabbing her. Most damning, he admitted raping her specifically to make it look like a random attack by a maniac, rather than a robbery by someone who knew the store. Minnie Ruth McCollum fought for her life for 6 days. From the morning of August 15, 1988, when she was found barely alive in the back room of the Handyway, until August 21st, she remained in the hospital in critical condition. The medical team did everything possible to save her, but the injuries she had sustained were too severe. Her brain swelling was so extensive that recovery was never a realistic possibility. She never regained consciousness. During those 6 days, the community of Palatka learned what had happened to the woman who had been a fixture at the local convenience store. News of the attack spread quickly through the small town. People who had known Minnie, who had bought their morning coffee or evening soda from her, were horrified by what had been done to her. The brutal nature of the attack, the sexual assault, the prolonged suffering she had endured, all combined to create a sense of shock and outrage. On August 21, 1988, Minnie Ruth McCollum died as a result of severe brain injury. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy documented the full extent of her injuries: the 334 bruises, the knife wounds, the strangulation marks, the fractured jaw, the massive head trauma. The cause of death was clear. Richard Randolph had beaten her so severely and for so long that her brain had swollen beyond the point where life could be sustained. Minnie's death meant that Richard Randolph, who had been arrested on charges of robbery, sexual battery, and attempted murder, was now facing a first-degree murder charge. The fact that Minnie had survived for 6 days meant that she had suffered longer than if she had died immediately. The prolonged nature of both the attack itself and her subsequent suffering would be factors that prosecutors would emphasize when seeking the death penalty. Richard's trial began in February 1989 in Putnam County, where a Confederate monument stood on the courthouse lawn. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Eyewitnesses who saw him leaving in Minnie's car, his girlfriend's testimony about his confession, and his own detailed confession to detectives. The jury found him guilty of first-degree murder, armed robbery, sexual battery, and grand theft. During the penalty phase, the defense called only one witness, psychologist Dr. Harry Kropp. Without access to records or family interviews, Dr. Kropp could only offer limited testimony about Richard's adoption by an unstable mother and abusive father. The prosecution countered with the medical examiner, who presented photographs showing 334 bruises on Minnie's body. The jury never heard the full extent of Richard's childhood abuse: the beatings with belts and broomsticks, the days locked in dark closets, the mother who told him he was worthless. Critical mitigating evidence was never presented. The jury voted 8-4 for death. In any other state, this split would have meant life in prison. In Florida, 8 votes were enough. The judge accepted the recommendation and, on April 5, 1989, sentenced Richard to death. In his order, the judge falsely concluded that Richard had been loved by both parents. Richard spent 37 years on death row. He converted to Islam, taking the name Malik Abdul Sajjad. He became a mentor to younger inmates, mediated conflicts, and maintained a spotless disciplinary record for over 14 years. Corrections experts said he posed no threat and could safely serve a life sentence. However, his health declined. He developed lupus, and doctors warned the lethal injection drugs would cause him to suffer terribly. In 2019, New York changed its adoption laws, allowing Sandra to finally access sealed records. She discovered her son was on death row in Florida. In 2022, she made contact with Malik. For the first time, he learned his birth mother had been a 17-year-old forced to give him up, not someone who simply did not want him. She learned that instead of the loving home she had imagined, he had been placed with parents who beat him and told him he was worthless. The guilt was overwhelming. Malik's appeals were denied at every level. His direct appeal was dismissed in 1990, though the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2016 that Florida's non-unanimous jury system was unconstitutional. The ruling was not made retroactive. Malik's clemency application was submitted in 2014, but Florida's process does not allow updated petitions before execution. No new information would be considered. In October 2025, Governor DeSantis signed Malik's death warrant for November 20, 2025. Malik called his birth mother just before her 80th birthday to tell her. His attorneys filed emergency motions presenting new evidence: his reunion with Sandra, his exemplary prison record, and concerns about his lupus causing a torturous death. Governor DeSantis denied relief without reviewing any of the new information. The courts rejected all of Malik Abdul-Sajjad's final appeals. The United States Supreme Court denied a stay of execution on the morning of November 20, 2025, just hours before the scheduled execution time of 6 o'clock that evening. This final denial meant that there were no remaining legal avenues to prevent the execution. The only possibility for mercy would have been clemency from Governor DeSantis, but DeSantis had already denied clemency when he signed the death warrant in October, and he showed no indication of reconsidering that decision. For his last meal, Malik chose a cheeseburger with fries, eggs, a soda, and ice cream. It was a simple meal, nothing elaborate or expensive. He declined to meet with a spiritual advisor, perhaps because his Islamic faith had given him the spiritual peace he needed to face what was coming. He spent his final hours in his cell at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida, where the death chamber was located. Outside the prison, approximately 50 protesters gathered for a vigil organized by Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. They held signs opposing capital punishment and stood in the designated area across the highway from the death chamber. Nearly 5,000 people had signed a petition urging Governor DeSantis to halt the execution, but the governor did not respond to these appeals. Among those who had opposed the execution were religious leaders, death penalty abolitionists, and people who believed that Malik's transformation and the circumstances of his childhood warranted mercy. At 6 o'clock in the evening, on November 20, 2025, Richard Barry Randolph, who had taken the name Malik Abdul-Sajjad 37 years earlier, was brought into the execution chamber. He was strapped to a gurney, and intravenous lines were inserted into his arms. Malik had no last words. The first lethal injection drug was administered at 6:02 p.m. According to John Koch, a news correspondent who served as a witness, Malik died just 10 minutes later. He was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m. Jordan Kirkland, the communications director for the Florida Department of Corrections, conducted a press briefing after the execution. He stated that the execution had taken place without incident. He added that members of Minnie Ruth McCollum's family had witnessed the execution, though their identities were not released to the press. Kirkland concluded his statement by saying, "The victim's family wanted me to thank the governor on their behalf." Sheriff Bruce Wilson of Putnam County, who had attended the execution, released his own statement. He said, "I attended the execution to bear witness for Mrs. McCollum's family and friends, as well as for all the men and women who worked on this case and are now retired or deceased, that justice was finally served." After 37 years, the legal proceedings that had begun with Minnie Ruth McCollum's brutal murder in August 1988 had concluded. Malik's birth mother, Sandra, who had found her son after 60 years only to lose him again to execution, mourned privately. The reunion she had waited for her entire adult life had lasted only 3 years. She had learned that the decision she made at 17, under pressure from her parents, believing she was giving her son a better life, had instead led to a childhood of abuse and trauma that contributed to a terrible crime and ultimately to his execution. The guilt and grief would be hers to carry for the rest of her life. Michelle Usry, who had known Minnie McCollum since childhood, as the friendly manager at the Handyway where she brought her Pepsi bottles to recycle, reflected on the execution. Standing across from what had been the Handyway, and was now a restaurant, she could still see the same doorway and window from 1988. She said, "What happens Thursday is just a result of the life that she lived and the happiness and the peace that she always gave to the routine every day, going in there and seeing her face." November 2025 will be remembered as one of the most significant months for capital punishment in modern American history. In just 8 days, 3 executions were carried out across 2 states, while a 4th man received a last-minute reprieve from a governor's act of mercy. Brian Frederick Jennings died on November 13, 2025, 46 years after he raped and murdered young Rebecca Kunesh. He was 66 years old. When asked for final words, he said only no. He offered no apology to the family whose daughter he had stolen from her bedroom in the middle of the night. Robert Kunesh died in 2001 without seeing his daughter's killer executed. Patricia Kunesh did not attend the execution. The family's grief remained private, as it had for nearly half a century. Stephen Bryant died by firing squad on November 14, 2025, for a 5-day killing spree that left 3 people dead and terrorized an entire community. He was 46 years old. The families of Clifton Gainey, Willard Tietjen, and Christopher Burgess had waited 21 years for justice. Tietjen's daughter Kimberly, who had heard Bryant taunt her on her dead father's phone, finally saw the man who called himself the Prowler face the ultimate consequence for his cruelty. Richard Barry Randolph, who had become Malik Abdul Sajjad during his 37 years on death row, died on November 20, 2025. He was 62 years old. His birth mother Sandra, who had searched for him for 50 years and found him only to learn he was awaiting execution, lost the son she had just begun to know. The baby she gave up in 1963, believing she was giving him a better life, had instead been delivered into a childhood of abuse and cruelty that shaped the man he became. The jury that sentenced him to death never heard the full story. Tremaine Wood was the only one spared. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt commuted his sentence to life in prison just moments before his scheduled execution on November 13, 2025. Wood had always maintained that while he participated in the robbery, it was his brother who actually committed the murder. His brother died in prison in 2019. We will never know the full truth, but Wood will live out his days behind bars rather than in a grave. These 4 cases force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and the society we have built. If you have made it this far, thank you for watching. These cases are difficult to tell and even more difficult to hear. They force us to sit with tragedy, to confront the worst of human nature, and to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers. If these stories affected you, if they made you think, if they helped you understand something you did not understand before, then they served their purpose. Please take a moment to subscribe to No Way Out and hit that notification bell. Your support helps this channel continue telling these stories, the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered, the stories of cases that shaped our justice system, and the stories that force us to ask hard questions about who we are and what we believe. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Every subscription, every share, every comment helps more people find these stories. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember, behind every case, behind every headline, behind every statistic, there are real people. People who lived, people who died, and people who are left behind to pick up the pieces. Never forget that.